Hello, everybody. We are celebrating, it's probably not the right word, 100 years of Donald Trump 2.0. And according to the Wall Street Journal, who generally are rather favorable, at least to the Republicans, he is in trouble. His polling is lower than any president in at least 7 decades, according to a new CNN poll. Most Americans see Trump as, quote unquote, a dangerous dictator, this poll shows. And everybody wants more checks on Trump, but they also have a very dim view of the Democratic opposition. It might be indeed not wise for Kamala Harris to make a speech today, and I'm not sure how popular she would be. Anyway, the real question then is, in spite of all Trump's unpopularity, the fear of him as a dictator or a clown, what should or shouldn't the Democrats do? Old friend of the show, David Masciotra, is a strongly opinionated writer, columnist, and he has a new piece out in Washington Monthly, What Liberals Can Learn from Ted Kennedy's Robert Bork America speech. David is joining us, as always. David, where are you? Indiana, as you always are?
Yes, Highland, Indiana.
So is this what Democrats should do? Articulate a Robert Bork America style Ted Kennedy speech to mourn 100 days of Trump?
Yeah, you in your introduction said 100 years, and although it certainly
Whoops, that was Freudian.
Right. It feels like we pack a year into every day with Trump and this gaggle surrounding him. But yeah, I argue in that essay. Well, first I look back on Ted Kennedy when Ronald Reagan nominated Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. It alarmed many people because Bork was instrumental in the firing of the special prosecutor who was investigating Nixon on the Watergate crimes. And perhaps even more alarmingly, I would argue, Bork was an opponent of the Civil Rights Acts, opponent of the Civil Rights Movement. He felt that Southern states had every right to implement poll taxes and put up other measures that were transparently designed to prevent blacks from exercising the franchise. And finally, Bork also said that there is no right to privacy in the Constitution. So that would not only have thrown out Roe versus Wade, but it would have thrown out an abundance of measures protecting Americans from illegal search and seizure.
Although I'm no great fan of Robert Bork, David, but in his defense, if there is a defense, he was a substantial intellectual, went to Yale Law School, taught there. I mean, was taken seriously by everyone. Not everyone would agree with him, but in contrast with some of these other legal characters and other kinds of characters that the Trump regime is throwing up, I'm guessing Bork wouldn't be a great friend of Trump.
Well, one never knows. Trump is implementing part of the Bork agenda in his assault on, well, he's already appointed justices in his first term who helped to deprive women of the right to choose. And Trump's, with this assault on what he labels as DEI, is undoing much of civil rights law, or at least attempting to do so. But what I argue in the piece is that Ted Kennedy really rose to the challenge, not with some off-the-cuff rant, but by having his staff do assiduous research into Bork and gain the endorsement of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which at the time was a consortium of over 100 civil rights and women's rights organizations. And he gave this speech in which he said in very clear, stark, and aggressive, one might even say inflammatory terms, Robert Bork's America is an America where blacks would have to sit behind segregated lunch counters, where women would be forced into having back alley abortions, where the government could censor artists, on a whim, and that was because
Yeah,
Bork
David,
had
we've heard this before. I mean, on the abortion front, perhaps you're right, but it's hard to imagine the Trump regime turning America back to segregated lunch counters. Are voters really going to believe this sort of stuff? They're just going to turn off. They're much more interested, it would seem to me, in the price of stuff at Walmart, or their wages, or inflation, or whether or not they have jobs. Are people going to believe those kind of scare stories?
Well, my argument is that someone needs to speak in perhaps not the exact same phrases, but speak with the same aggression and clarity of Ted Kennedy. And what Ted Kennedy did so well, in addition to his mastery of the US Senate, was he rallied the Democratic base of voters. And now we have a Democratic Party whose leadership, more often than not, ignores their base in an attempt to chase down this mythical middle, this moderate who is supposedly very discerning and nuanced, but seemingly does not exist. The Republican Party rallies their base, and therefore they have a cadre of voters who are willing to co-sign the right-wing agenda, no matter how reactionary, no matter how extreme or dangerous. The Democratic Party neglects its base and therefore alienates the voters they most need to not only show up at the polls, but to donate, to volunteer, to advocate. Now, to your question, I mean, I'm not a Democratic strategist or pollster, but I think that the future of the rule of law and civil society and democracy and freedom of expression and due process is and are important enough that opposition leadership, which is what the Democratic Party is, needs to speak to those issues. And if Americans don't care about their democracy, they don't care about the rule of law, if they don't care about human rights, then that speaks to their own failures, and it would suggest that the game in some sense is already lost, because even if you could hit Trump on the tariffs and the economic maladies that people will soon suffer due to his whack job policies, some other reactionary figure is going to come around and win the argument at a later point. So these are bedrock issues of American society, and there are a few Democrats speaking to them with the aggression of Kennedy, but I'd like to see it more frequently and more consistently.
Cory Booker, of course, made a filibustered speech, 24 hours, 18 minutes, a week or two ago. Today, I think he, with the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, is hosting a sit-in on Capitol steps. Do we need more of this symbolic sit-in? What do you think of Booker's speech? Is this in the tradition of Ted Kennedy's Robert Bork speech?
I thought so, and I made a passing reference to it in my essay. It was what I liked about Booker's speech, even if it didn't accomplish anything, unlike Kennedy's speech. Kennedy's speech initiated a movement against Bork that resulted in his rejection. Booker's speech didn't accomplish anything tangible, but it did communicate the abnormality of the Trump administration's assault on public health and healthcare programs. Those were the main focal points of Booker's speech. And abnormal actions from the White House demand abnormal responses from Democrats in Congress and elsewhere. So I appreciated the spirit of it and the drama of it. And that
earlier this week, David, we ran a conversation I had with the Istanbul-based political thinker Solio Zel, who talked about in our conversation comparing Turkey and the US, he said that the US lacked a unified opposition or a coherent alternative opposition, in contrast with Istanbul's Mayor Imamoglu, who has been who the Erdogan regime is trying to put in jail. Why is that the case in the US? Why have the Democrats failed so visibly to put a unified face and a coherent face, a face that popular opinion would be sympathetic with, especially given the self-evidently absurd and dangerous nature of the Trump administration?
That's obviously an important question. In some respect, the failure dates back many years. I remember once interviewing Bruce Bartlett, who was a staff member for the Reagan administration and the George H.W. Bush administration. And he talked about how back in the late 80s and early 90s, Republican members of Congress would meet on a weekly basis with Grover Norquist. And Norquist would essentially give them an agenda of what to discuss that week. So therefore, they would all parrot the same phrases, the same attack lines. Then when talk radio and Fox News come into fruition, those media apparatuses acted as a megaphone for those things. And he said back then, Democrats had nothing of the kind, and they still don't. So for a long time, the Democratic Party has neglected building the infrastructure necessary to speak with unity and to speak with enough volume that it gets the attention.
But David, isn't the problem that, for better or worse, and in some ways this is for better, the Democratic Party isn't united? There's clearly at least two wings. On the one hand, there's the Bernie Sanders AOC wing. On the other hand, there's the Ezra Klein centrist Rebuild America technocratic wing. And there's probably a lot of people in between. So it's hard for a party to actually speak with one voice.
Yeah, I think I'm in between those two wings. It's just the most enjoyable position because then
well, if you're in between, it's the old joke about roadkill in Texas. Anything in the middle of the road gets run over. So
well, I do it because it allows me to act like a prick to everybody. But to your question, that I would take that in another direction. I mean, it is good to have a party that has robust debate and disagreement. You don't want to resemble an autocratic personality cult that like the Republican Party has become. However, there is a problem if we look at the media, particularly the new media, which is what we're doing right now, the podcasts, YouTube shows. Almost all of the popular right-leaning hosts endorse and praise everything Trump does, and like lemmings attack everything the Democrats do. Whereas most of the most popular left-leaning hosts also attack the Democratic Party. They claim the Democratic Party's insufficiently progressive. They sell out to big business and corporate interests. They're weak, they're woke. Maybe some of that's true, maybe some of it isn't, but it creates a problem of asymmetry in which a new media consumer goes online and hears almost nothing but bashing of the Democratic Party.
So are you suggesting that the Democrats should? Are you suggesting that the Democrats should essentially lie like the Republicans? I mean, the fact that they're honest, doesn't that reflect well on them, that there are divisions, that they don't agree on everything?
Oh yeah. What I'm saying though, I'm saying the debate is good. The debate is good, but for whatever reasons, the Democratic Party suffers from a lack of amplified advocacy in these media worlds. I mean, outside of MSNBC and maybe a few columnists for the big newspapers, which are losing relevance each day, they don't have that kind of apparatus behind them. Whether that reflects positive qualities or negative qualities, it's merely one way of answering your question. Why aren't the Democrats presenting a united front of opposition, unlike what's happening in Turkey and what happened in Poland when they overturned authoritarian leaders recently?
David, we've done some shows recently about how some people, particularly in Silicon Valley, are actually Peter Layden, for example, former editor at Wired, has a popular Substack page. He believes that if you just leave Trump alone, he's essentially destroying the Republican brand by wrecking America, wrecking trade policy, undermining so much of what people trust about the Republican Party, that this will actually enable a new 30-year rule of the Democratic Party. Do you think there's any truth in that? I mean, others have argued that we should just let Trump wreck the country and not essentially say anything.
No, I disagree with that assessment, and here's why. I've argued that what Trump is doing is vastly worse than his predecessors. However, I've lived through this cycle before in which a Republican president executes policies that are very harmful and thereby very unpopular. A Democratic president succeeds that president, does a number of positive reforms, but the entire time has this echo chamber against him. And then the American electorate votes in a Republican again.
So what's the positive model? I take that point. I'm assuming you're pointing to people like Clinton. What's the positive model?
or I mean, and again, I would say that what Trump's doing is vastly worse than George W. Bush domestically.
We always heard that, though. Ever since I've been in this country, I'm always hearing this is unprecedented. I heard it with Reagan. I heard it with Bush 1 and 2, and now I'm hearing it with Trump again. Do we have to be careful to always talk about unprecedented?
I didn't say unprecedented. I said worse.
Or worse. I mean, it's always worse.
Well, I mean, I would argue that what Trump is doing is worse domestically than anything George W. Bush did. Bush's foreign policy was worse because of the Iraq War. But Bush left office, the Republican Party was in shambles, to the extent that there were many people predicting, just like the gentleman you quoted, that we might not see a Republican president again for 20, 30 years. Obama served 2 terms fairly successfully, and then Trump becomes president. So the American people have a short memory. Gore Vidal famously referred to our country as the United States of amnesia. And what the reactionary mind is very good at is repackaging these old fears and biases to make them seem fresh and transgressive. And that's something I could see happening in 4 to 8 years. But in the short term, if Trump continues as he's doing, and there's no sign of him stopping, yes, the Democrats should be able to clean up in the midterms and perhaps even in the next presidential election, because he certainly already made himself very unpopular, and that's only going to get worse. I don't think these people know how to reform.
What is it about the Kennedys, David, that encourages us to always go back to them? You've gone back to Ted Kennedy's Bork speech in your latest piece. I've always been interested in RFK's Ripple of Hope speech in 1966 in South Africa. Of course, JFK's speeches are also enormously popular and relevant today. Did the Kennedys, were they just good at making speeches, or are we talking about a different period where speeches were more relevant, particularly from the left?
No, that's true. Certainly, speeches were more relevant then, and I make that point in the piece that someone couldn't really repeat what Ted Kennedy did because few have his stature, and we don't have a media monoculture to promote a speech like that. But the Kennedys are very useful. We can always go back to them for a source of insight and inspiration uh, because, well, they had charisma, and that's important. That's an intangible quality that's hard to measure, but it's important. They also had a certain toughness and bravado that in order to fight for democratic values, for liberalism, they were able to, they were willing to get a little dirty and to become combative and confrontational. And that kind of bellicosity is missing.
Well, the old Joe Kennedy brought his sons up to behave like that. Does it require aristocrats or scions of aristocrats like Ted Kennedy and RFK, JFK to be able to do this?
I don't think that's a requirement, but it probably helps. I think the Kennedys, they all felt rather untouchable in a certain respect. I mean, the family suffered greatly due to violence, but politically untouchable, financially untouchable. And there's something hopeful and inspiring about a family of immense wealth and privilege that puts their wealth and privilege to use in service of idealism. And that's what those three did in their
Are
own
there
way.
equivalents today? I mean, might the Obamas, for example, be the equivalent of the Kennedys?
There was that hope. I mean, Obama was certainly Kennedy-esque during his first campaign for the presidency, and he had some important achievements, mainly the Affordable Care Act as president. But the way that the Obamas have retreated from public life is something that one would have never expected Ted Kennedy to do, or John or Robert Kennedy, had their lives not been cut short by assassins'
Yeah,
bullets.
it's the ideal of public service. We did a show a couple of years ago with John A. Farrell, who wrote a book about Ted Kennedy. And Farrell argued that Kennedy became a great man when he was most distanced from the presidency. In other words, when people stopped thinking about him as the next president, then he became a great man of the Senate. In terms of this
Farrell's book's
speech,
very good.
yeah, in terms of this speech, David, is there a line from the Robert Bork's America speech that still is relevant that you would cite to somehow summarize what he was saying?
Well, what I cite more than a particular line is the tone of it. That Robert Bork's America is one in which we're going to experience a severe setback of rights for many people, of opportunities for many people, namely women and racial minorities. And that's exactly what we're seeing now with the Trump administration, vis-a-vis women, vis-a-vis immigrants, vis-a-vis LGBTQ people, particularly transgender. We did a show on that. So I think that the question of universal human rights must guide any form of liberal politics that is worth its weight. And one thing that Democrats could also learn from Ted Kennedy is to embrace that position. I make a point in the article that Kennedy didn't go on TV to decry the supposed toxicity of the Democratic brand, even though Reagan had just won a historic landslide, defeating Mondale in every state but Minnesota. The Kennedys never looked weak. And I find all of this Democratic self-flagellation, Bush League and weak and borderline pathetic, have those conversations in private. Right now, you have a job to do, and that job is the opposition.
Should Harris be, I mean, you can't stop her speaking, but shouldn't she just go away and do something else, given how poorly she performed?
I think that people can, I mean, she didn't perform that poorly. We've had this disagreement before. She made some critical errors, but
Well, the critical error, in my view, and maybe I don't know if we need to go back over this, is she could never explain why she wanted to be president. But that
right,
seems fairly.
which coincidentally is what sank Ted Kennedy's primary run against Carter, as he had trouble
Yeah,
explaining.
maybe she should go back into. Well, she's going to be running probably for California governor. What about the resistance? I mentioned earlier, David,
to answer your question about Harris, regardless of our assessment on her, she earned tens and tens of millions of votes. I think she has every right to give a speech, and the Democratic base of voters will, in this case, vote with their feet. They'll either continue to pay attention to her or not.
Remember that debate with Reagan and Carter, when Carter was going on about something, and Reagan said something like, well, there you go again, and you've heard it all before. I wonder, though, if someone gave this Kennedy speech that you want, the Robert Bork's America speech, about taking away the rights of African Americans and immigrants, blah, blah, blah. We've heard this speech so many times before. I mean, Trump doesn't have Reagan's political skills or his rhetorical skills, but you've said that something's different now with Trump, and yet what you're calling for is almost a business as usual Democratic speech. The standard Democratic speech, oh, the Republicans are taking away all our rights.
I disagree with you. I don't think that's business as usual. I think that the Democrats, so one of Kamala Harris's main errors was that she ran a positive-oriented campaign. Hillary Clinton, when she ran against Trump, ran a positive-oriented campaign. Social psychology 101 tells us people fear losses more than they like gains. And most Americans in November of 2024, because they don't pay close attention to the news, were not aware of Trump's plan for mass deportation. They were not aware of the implications of the tariffs. They were not aware of the various other methods of persecution that Trump would adopt. And just when Project 2025 was starting to go national, because Democrats were talking about it, the Obama consultant class intervened with Harris and convinced her to run this joy-based, positive campaign. I'm going to help you buy a home. I'm going to help you start a small business. Good policies, but politically ineffective. Now, if you go back to the campaign that did defeat Trump, Joe Biden, he launched his campaign with, remember, the Soul of America speech, connecting Trump to Crawfordsville, and the anti-Semitic racist march that took place there, resulting in the death of Heather Heyer. So I think that there's some good political science on this. Christopher Parker is one who's studied this. Democrats tend to run positive-oriented campaigns. Republicans tend to run very dark, fear-based campaigns, and the latter is much more successful. And I've been called, a Trump alarmist. I've been diagnosed with Trump derangement syndrome. But I would say,
have you been to the doctor, David, for your derangement syndrome?
No, I'm self-medicating. But I would say that these first 100 days have proven people like me correct. They vindicated us, considering that Trump's sending people to an El Salvadoran super prison without due process. He's ordering the detention of student protesters. He's allowing Robert F. Kennedy Jr., speaking of Kennedys, to dismantle our entire public health system, which will undoubtedly result in many deaths if it continues. And then you have the tariffs that have already wreaked tremendous financial havoc and will continue to do so. So the alarmists were correct, and the deranged were not so deranged.
Finally, David, I mentioned I like, you mentioned RFK Jr. His father made a great speech, the Day of Affirmation address, known as the Ripple of Hope speech, 1966 in South Africa. And the most famous part of that speech, he said, "It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest wall of oppression and resistance." Might that RFK speech from 1966 be the inspiration for the resistance against Trump? None of us can be heroes, but if we all do something, perhaps we can build up what RFK called the ripples that can sweep down the mightiest wall of oppression and resistance.
Yeah, and I think that this is where we can have a meeting in the middle, as it were. Hope we don't end up like the roadkill in Texas, but it doesn't have to all be doom and gloom and denunciation and condemnation. You do need idealism, and that's what the Kennedys had in spades, and that's why they were able to inspire people. And if you look at a slightly dumbed down version of that speech, Obama's "Yes, we can." Effective leaders engender a feeling of possibility, that we can create these ripples of hope. Yes, we can become part of, he had referenced Rosa Parks and other heroes of American reform and progressive life. So after the condemnation and denunciation, you have to give people something to do. And that's where this Kennedy-like idealism, and we could perhaps call it Obama assertiveness, can be quite powerful.
Well, the Kennedys still matter. Maybe not RFK Jr., but certainly his father. And David says Ted Kennedy, his great Robert Bork's America speech, is still relevant. Someone needs to pull it out of their pocket and rephrase it for our age. Maybe Cory Booker, maybe Hakeem Jeffries. David, it's not going to be 100 years. It's only 100 days, and we will talk in the days ahead, because this story is certainly not ended. So keep well, keep writing, and I'd love to have you back on the show again.